So the stages of grief. Kubler-Ross's stages of grief: denial, anger, depression, bargaining, acceptance. I've shared with you before that grief actually starts at the moment of conception, when you're kicked out of heaven, the universal consciousness, the big cookie dough, the Garden of Eden. So the reason it's grief is because that's when you're given your earthly form. So grief is an earthly disease. Grief is an earthly manifestation. It does not exist in the spirit world. The spirit realm is despair, which we'll talk about. So part of what happens with grief is that you use the grief. And again, this is not to minimize that grief doesn't exist. I was in grief for 3 years on a couch. It's that if we don't want to sit with our thoughts, emotions, and desires, our low consciousness, what we really think about, we'll never get out of that to become the Sirius, to become the divine, to become the Christ consciousness. So we use the pain of the grief, the anger, the denial, the bargaining, why me, why not you? So that we can stay in our sort of low level consciousness and not really sit with our thoughts. Grief well done leads you to the reality of your utility, of the reality that you possess, the reality that you have an earthly consciousness, and can lead you to the divine consciousness of despair. Grief is human earthly consciousness. Grief is deep sorrow, a loss in the physical realm. You lost something physical, a person, place, thing, or situation you were not done using yet. It can lead you to the spirit. It can lead you to doing your divine work, your spiritual work. But if you don't experience in the earthly realm, then you may not ever get to the divine. That's why I said those Saturn cycles are there, nudging and nudging and nudging and nudging. But a lot of times, most people just don't really get it, that a Pluto has to come in and say, I'm taking this from you. You're going to be forced to look at this. And you can even pilfer that experience. So you forget your God. You use it as a smokescreen to pretend that you're not, that you didn't create all of this, and then you get right back into your vicious cycle of the psychological homeostasis. I have a theory of 5 types of despair. One despair is called delusional despair. It's where you choose, are you going to be human and live a human earthly existence and hate yourself and self-betray and live half a person, or are you going to live both a spiritual divine existence and an earthly existence? This is what Jesus and Buddha came to teach. If you stay in your delusional despair, which I'll explain momentarily, then you simply stay in your grief process. But it's the grief process that leads you to delusional despair that makes you decide to choose a path. Who would you be without your story, and what would you lose? In my 7 gates, the 3rd step is, what need does it fulfill when something happens in your life that causes problems? What are you proving? What happens when you stop proving that you're not worthy? What happens when you stop proving that you're unlovable? What happens when you start proving that you're not really lazy? What are you holding on to with that story? Just your earthly consciousness, and not wanting to be divine, and not wanting to do divine in this limited form. You utilize when you are done. Notice that if you break up, or you lose the job because you quit, you're in power. It's a power struggle. It's a power issue. I have finished utilizing you, causes no grief. Same loss on paper. You still broke up, you still got divorced, you still lost the job. But it's when you're done with the utility that the grief process sets in. And it's done when I'm done leaving the universal consciousness. You didn't decide, quote unquote, God kicked you out. It was time again to now burn karma, a limitation, that you go into grief. But that's really at the soul level, which is despair. So hidden truths, the types of despair. This is my theory of hidden truths and despair. Despair is utter hopelessness. It is a loss without meaning. At the root, we don't really understand. Our divine, our soul, our spirit does not understand why we need an earthly body. Why do we get extracted from the universal cookie dough? We don't get that. We surely don't understand, because we don't have access to the higher planes, why we needed to leave God, why we needed to use the universal womb and the universal consciousness to do it in this body. That's what we feel at the moment of conception. That's why the river of forgetfulness in the Greek mythology, you have to forget everything prior and just live in this world. But we know more. We know that we're the universe. We know that we're divine, and we struggle. Despair is a spiritual disease. It is spiritual consciousness. It's knowing you're the divine, but how do you do it in this body, limited, pooping and peeing and sleeping? Makes no sense. This is the root of all conundrums. Despair is spiritual grief for being in the physical realm. You have no worth or meaning in a body, is what you think, because you haven't really understood the wisdom of the heart, from the head to the heart, that the only way to burn karma, grow spiritually, return home to the universal cookie dough, is through this physical body. That's where illness serves as a narcissistic tendency. Illness means I am beyond the body. Let me hurt and destroy the vessel, the vehicle of my divine being, because I don't need it. It's really crazy when you really think about it. So I've delineated 5 types of despair. There's universal despair. This is when you leave heaven. This is when you leave God. This is when you're kicked out of the Garden of Eden. This is at the moment of conception. There's separateness despair when you leave the womb, when you have your birth. This is when you identify in your consciousness you are separate. Usually the babies are put on the mother's body to identify that their body is different from their mother's. We know that we are no longer part of that supposed symbiotic relationship, which is more parasitic, but what we internalize to be the equal of the universal consciousness. So it's a double whammy. You get out of the universal cookie dough, and now you get out of the womb. You're like just beat down. Of course it's sorrow. Of course it's hopelessness. It's a loss without meaning. Why? The third despair is innocence despair, which is when you have your first sexual experience. This could be masturbation, this could be intercourse, or this can be just petting and touching, whatever you feel is your first sexual experience, is when you experience innocent despair. The biggie here, what I was talking about before, is delusional despair. This is when you leave your snow globe. This is when you leave your toxic waters. This is when you leave the emotional and psychological homeostasis, and you've got Pluto that shatters that, disrupts the system for you. You ask for it, your curse, so that you can learn to navigate grief and bring it into despair so that you get to make a choice. Delusional despair is the bridge between the earthly consciousness and the divine consciousness. And you choose, do I want to stay linked to the earthly world, the world of form, the world of illusion, the world of grief, the world of possessions, or do I actually want to go into my spiritual divine light and decide to make change? This is the key, this delusional despair. Every single one of us. Now, if you're lucky enough to really get it with the Saturn cycles and you can avoid a Pluto, no one can avoid a Pluto ever. We all have something, some worse than others, depending on our level of consciousness. But if you get these small steps along the way with Saturn, this delusional despair can be a little less for you. Mine was obviously very disastrous and destructive because I needed a big wake-up call. And then our last despair is when we leave the body, ironically, and we go back to the universal cookie dough, the universal consciousness, and we're leaving the body. That terminal despair is linked directly to how you transition in phases. It's linked to your birth story. I was fast and furious. I burned through everything. If I do that again, I will suffer upon my death. I have to slow down, take a breath, pause. That's my birth story. We have to do it differently so that leaving the body, the terminal despair, isn't so severe. So I'm not the only one that has gotten to these conclusions. I say them in my language, in my way, and I expound on some of these philosophers. So Søren Kierkegaard said in his book, Sickness Unto Death, despair doesn't affect a person, it affects a self. That's the same way of saying that it's a spiritual disease. Remember your brilliant diamond covered in honey. All of the honey, all of the worthlessness, all the unmet needs, all the conditional love, the Costco membership, that low-level consciousness of the manger that you got from your parents is simply that you're not able to get to that soul, to that self, to that divine will, to that spiritual STD. That's what you're mourning. That's what your despair is. He equates the soul to the self. I call it the soul. He calls it the self, or self-worth, or self-love. It's been said many different ways, the third chakra. Despair is a spiritual sickness. So he says there's 3 types of despair. He says inauthentic despair is ignorance that you don't know you have a self aside from finite reality. This is that recognition of people that think they're just material, they're just earthly. They don't even have sort of like an idea that there's a spiritual consciousness. So those people would probably be asleep. One of the things I forgot to mention about the Cain and Abel story is that Cain, after he killed Abel, his divine self, which is basically what Kierkegaard is saying, he had to wander into the land of Nod. He was a wanderer. Wanderer is someone who has no spiritual plan, no spiritual compass, no spiritual guidance. In the land of Nod, symbolic of low-level asleep consciousness. He was asleep. There are people that are asleep and don't even realize there's a spiritual nature. So that's what he calls inauthentic despair. The second is refusal to accept the self as infinite. You only address the material world and you don't even address your spirit. That's where most people are. We have 50% of ourself, even if we're in the guise of spirituality. Do not get, again, confused with the illusion and the form. In the guise of spirituality, you live in the finite world. You only meet your earthly desires. If you have to eat, sleep, poop, have sex every single day, earthly desires, go to work, pay your bills every day, what makes you think that you don't have to give the other aspect of yourself, which is your spirit, 50%? I say the 48 to 52. Both need attending to. And he's saying here, you're only attending to your finite self. Sartre had a similar concept called the bad self concept. He says that individuals act inauthentically by yielding to pressures of society to adopt false values and disown their freedom as sentient human beings. This is my theory of all of the value systems and the valor years and the spiritual striptease. You need to get down and dirty. When I say guilt is a placeholder emotion, that's what he's talking about. You don't feel guilty. You feel something less socially acceptable and you don't want to admit it, so you call it guilt. You're false and you're inauthentic and you're a fraud. Self is not constant. It can't be a thing in the world. This is what people struggle with. There's no right or wrong. There's no good or bad. There isn't strict guidelines of what to do. And so we say good and bad in moral terms. It's not. It's our value system. It's what we define. That's why step 4 in the 7 gates is define the need. It's linked to the value system. Judgments are confessions and they're great. It tells me what you value. Everything is gray in spirituality and people don't like the gray areas. So part of the process of the 0 to 100, getting to that 48 to 52 is getting very comfortable with the gray, but having a container around it, having some boundaries and limits around that, what that looks like, and also using law of correspondence, everything is as a message so that you can see what the universe is guiding you with. We are guided. And my favorite is that all roles end. I said that before. All roles end. Everything has an expiration. Your wife, your mother, your employee, all of it. Because ultimately, the return back home to Venus in Truth 11 and 12 of my path is that you have to dethrone everything, even yourself, even your dogma, because love is beyond all of that. We're very, very far from that, but that is ultimately the goal of the divine feminine and the age of Aquarius. And then Kierkegaard says that his third is demonic despair. You know that you're earthly and divine, but you refuse to acknowledge your dependence on love. This is the divine feminine. This is the Aphrodite Urania. I struggle with this a lot. Like, I'm very confident in my self-worth. I know that I dedicate half my day or my life to my spiritual and my material, but I have so much trouble getting to that heart space of the soft corners of dethroning myself or my theories or my dogma. I'm so not there yet. That's okay. That is demonic despair. That's what made me cry this morning. Like realizing that I'm so close to it, I'm seeing it. People at work are showing me this, and I'm still not there to able to touch it and get it yet. That's okay. That's the spiritual journey. It's the entire process of spirituality and a life is to get that. So Schopenhauer, Freud, and Thanatos. Freud and Schopenhauer both agree that death is the goal of life. Freud talked about a death drive that was self-destructive. My view on his view of the death drive is a little different, but I do believe that everybody has pain as pleasure or pleasure as pain as a death drive, basically an instinct to self-destruct. We are all self-destructive. We all want to reach a point of height and then take ourselves down from it. That's why when they say too big to fail or it's lonely at the top, you inevitably self-destruct because you haven't achieved that balance or build a team or realize the heart, realize the love, realize that you need others to sort of support you on your way up and that it's a team. And the interesting thing about when I was breaking down my values of teamwork, which is one of my big value systems, teamwork, you think, or leadership, I'm sorry, my value of leadership is hierarchical, you think, but there's no hierarchy in the universe. So I had to bring it down to a cyclical thing. I had to bring it to teamwork rather than leadership. I can lead only by helping myself, healing myself, and then radiating those lessons out. So it was a struggle that I had personally, but all of us are self-destructive. Thanatos' goal of all death is life, which is the Saturn and the Pluto, is so that you truly live, so that you truly experience, and you truly get to the Aphrodite Urania, which is we're all the same. We're all cookie doughs, little clips of the cookie doughs doing divine work. And if we judge it, it's because it's a judgment in self. Thanatos is also a son of Nyx, that I mentioned earlier, the night, and carries you off into the underworld. So Thanatos has 7 siblings. So when you're talking about grief and despair, you're talking about these. These are earthly siblings. So in the grief, if you're suffering because you're getting old or old age, if you're suffering because it's suffering, which Buddha said suffering is optional, if you're creating or feeling doom, if you're feeling or creating deception, if you're creating or feeling blame, which goes with shame, if you're feeling or creating strife or retribution, these are linked to grief. These are the siblings of grief. And these are the things that you're feeling in terms of your grief in your earthly consciousness. The spiritual consciousness is despair and doesn't have these, so that you can relate those to one another.